back, everybody, to the pre-admission game with Aaron and Mitch. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm really well. We're out of lockdown again. I think it's a bit of a running
Again?
I think last time we spoke, or in an earlier episode, we talked about how we'd just come out of lockdown and then we went back into lockdown again. Now we're back out
of lockdown. Here's to the next episode being back in lockdown. So today's episode, we're going to have a little bit of a chat about unpacking the black box mystery that is the GAMSAT exam, specifically the GAMSAT marks. Because we're all in a little bit of a rat race trying to achieve the best mark possible.
Absolutely.
But the numbers are a bit of a mystery, aren't they?
They can be a little bit confusing. I think, there's just so much anxiety about the GAMSAT in general and trying to get into medicine. And, it's like the rest of my life that, it's very easy to kind of start panicking and to listen to what everybody says, and everybody has a slightly different opinion. So, there's a lot to kind of, I think, unpack. And, there's a lot of, I guess, stuff that isn't right, a lot of stuff that is right. So I think it's good to maybe set the record straight.
Set the record. How do we interpret the golden goose, right? We'll dive right into it, right, Mitch? So the first question I think any GAMSAT student or prospective GAMSAT student has is, okay, so they've paid for the exam, they're waiting to sit the exam. How do you actually receive the results? What do those results look like?
Sure. So yeah, exactly. So you've sat the exam, you've gone through that whole anxiety, and then unfortunately you have kind of about a month and a half of just biting your nails and just kind of waiting for that day to come. Right. Whenever it eventually does come, essentially what you're going to get is an email, to the email that you registered through, and it's just going to be an email saying your results have been released. It'll kind of lead you to a link. You'll log into the Acer website, and right there in front of you is your score. It's not very kind of ceremonious or anything like that. It just kind of pops up, and obviously the emotional repercussions of that follow.
We'll deal with that in a sec. So even though the test is now digital, so it's done on a computer, it's not one of those digital tests where you get the score immediately afterwards.
No. So unlike, other tests, like for the example, the UCAT, where you do get, some kind of score 24 hours after you do it. So with the GAMSAT, it is unfortunately a pretty hefty wait. So, it can be pretty late. So, for example, the March GAMSAT is usually held kind of around the start of March, and then the release of those marks actually comes in about May. Usually, when we look at kind of past years, it kind of happens anywhere from about the 10th or so to about the 20th, maybe even a little bit earlier. This year, it was actually like a little bit more delayed than people expected. For any of those that I guess kind of are on Reddit and stuff like that, there were kind of days of just people refreshing and everybody speculating as to when it would come, and then it eventually dropped on the 18th. So it does come a little bit later after the exam.
Yeah, when we were sitting at Mitch, I don't remember Acer letting us know when it would be released, right?
I think we just knew that roughly at the end of the month we would expect, something to happen.
Yeah.
And then I think we were all in classes or something like that, and then sort of it became clear that GAMSAT had dropped in because we were doing biomedicine. Everyone's scurrying around, trying to find a computer to check their results.
Yeah, you just see scattered people crying, others celebrating.
Yeah, that's
right. So what's your hot take on checking your exam results mid-lecture?
Look, honestly, I reckon just do it. I think the anticipation of not knowing and stuff like that is far too stressful. I checked mine, I got a ping when I was literally in the car, and I pulled over on the side of the road.
That's sensible.
Sorry?
Sensible.
Yeah, sensible, exactly. I didn't want to...
That he pulled over
I pulled over, exactly. And I just checked it right there and then because, the idea of having all my friends with me and my family and stuff was far too stressful. I didn't want to have to see their faces after, having my results exposed.
I do remember it was the opposite for me. I had an exam that day. And I, needed the outcome of the exam to be good, obviously, if I wanted to go into medicine. So I was like, oh, crap, I'm going to wait, sit the exam, and then when I go home, I'll check.
Yeah.
So whatever way you do it, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't really matter.
Exactly.
the damage is already done.
Exactly. The score's not changing.
Absolutely. So you're saying about 2 months, March to May, that's sort of the waiting period between exam and results. And would you say it's about the same with the September sitting too?
Yeah, exactly right. Usually you're getting it in about kind of November, early November, early to mid-November.
Right. You get the ping, you click on your email, you get taken via the hyperlink to the Acer website. What is the actual format? What do you see on the screen? How does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if people are really curious, they can just look this up. Tickets, the GAMSAT ticket, which is basically what comes up. There's tons of images of it. So if you really want to know what it looks like, you definitely can just Google it. But essentially, it'll give you 4 scores. It'll give you your individual section scores for Section 1, Section 2, Section 3, and then it'll give you your overall score.
Yep. Yep. Okay.
And obviously, now with universities interpreting GAMSAT in different ways, your GAMSAT score isn't necessarily the score that your university of choice.
That's
is
the
going to be
overall score, the final number that you're talking about, Mitch.
Well,
right.
I suppose you're the
Yeah.
Sure.
expert.
Let me jump in here, guys. Yes, exactly. So exactly like you said, there is, the score that you have looking at your overall score isn't necessarily going to be the score that your university is going to consider. So there's 2 exceptions, I guess, to just universities considering that overall score. So firstly, you have universities that look at your average score. So traditionally, the way that the GAMSAT works is that your Section 1 and Section 2 scores are just kind of taken as they are, but then your Section 3 score is double weighted. So that's obviously favored people with a really strong science background, because if you've done, somewhat average in Section 1 and Section 2, you've been able to, because Section 3 is double weighted, if you've been able to do really well there, you can kind of compensate.
Yeah, that was what I had. No, I relied on that.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. As
I was like, please just make my Section 1 be as worth as less as possible.
Exactly. As a biomed student, that's really the mentality. But nowadays, I guess some universities, and those universities are universities like the University of Melbourne, Notre Dame, yep. And I think the University of Queensland as well. They are now taking your average score. So that means that your Section 3 score is actually just weighted equally with your Section 1 and Section 2. So, I guess that means that for people getting their score back, you don't necessarily have to be dismayed if you haven't done too well in Section 3, because there are some universities that are going to weigh Section 1 and Section 2 equally, so that obviously gives you a bit of an advantage.
And all of this information is available on the university-specific web pages on the FIT website, guys, just in case you're wondering.
Yeah, absolutely. Another kind of way that universities are, or one university is looking at your GAMSAT scores is the University of Sydney. They're now kind of looking at your individual section scores. They're not really looking at an overall score. So that's a different way as well. So the GAMSAT score, I guess, your overall one is no longer the only currency. Now you're seeing universities interpreting your GAMSAT scores in slightly different ways to kind of match their own values and kind of what they want to do with that.
Right. There are pretty significant implications to that, specifically this application season, because you can actually have quite a high overall score. You might even have a really good Section 2, really good Section 3 score, we're talking in the 70s. And then you go to apply to USyd, and because they rank you, they rank Section 1 first, then they rank you in Section, they put everybody on a ladder for Section 2, then they put everybody on a ladder for Section 3. You might find that you've won in Section 3, you might have the top score in the class, but then you're sort of middle or maybe even bottom of the pack in Section 1 and 2, and even though your overall score, even if no matter how you cut the cake, no matter how you average it, is pretty good, you find that according to the USyd system, you're perhaps less competitive. So it's with USyd specifically, it's even less important to look at your final score and more important to look at your individual scores and really not neglect them if that's the route that you want to be applying.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the standard is still to just look at your overall score. I mean, most universities will still use that. But yeah, absolutely. We're seeing kind of a bit of a shift happening where universities are now kind of considering the GAMSAT in a more kind of non-traditional way.
Right. So I suppose just for other people, thinking about the implication, just think, your GAMSAT isn't just a GAMSAT anymore. There's lots of different ways to look at it, and your university of choice, might not take that score, as read. So you really need to be aware of where your GAMSAT is going to be best looked at by the individual universities to put yourself in the best, put your best foot forward, so to speak.
Yeah. Sort of a pre-test, post-test probability type of situation for all of you stats nuts out there. So I guess before you set the GAMSAT, you should be trying to optimize all 3 sections. Don't bank on one section. But after you receive your result, it's a good idea to look at your scores and think, okay, well, which university calculation are these scores going to be a good fit with?
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. When, like I said, as part of kind of that student support role, I have a lot of conversations with students after GAMSAT results come out. And yeah, that, is really the majority of the conversations. It's looking at their GAMSAT result and thinking, okay, where are you the most competitive applicant?
Yeah, that's awesome. And because Fraser's obviously is a GAMSAT, and they've got ties to FIT and other sort of branches of the pre-admission to sort of medical school, I suppose there's a lot of understanding and expertise in that area, no matter where you are in your application cycle.
So the thing that I would like to know before we shift the conversation over to discussing how the score is calculated is, I remember, so I've been in med for a couple of years now, and I know that recently, for whatever reason, to relive the glory days, I logged into my Acer account and I tried to find my GAMSAT ticket, right? And I actually couldn't access it anymore. When I have this ticket, when I get it after sitting the exam, do I need to download it? Do I need to keep it? Do I need a physical copy for my med application?
Good question. Essentially, the way that most applications work is that they happen through GEMSAS, right? That's kind of the consortium where most medical universities kind of operate through, and through which you apply. So when you actually go to apply to them, essentially what they'll ask you to do is they'll ask you to put in your GAMSAT candidate ID, and this is essentially how your application will be linked to your GAMSAT score. So you're not going to have to upload your tickets or anything like that. They'll automatically liaise with Acer directly and kind of get your results through there. This is the same process, for Flinders and UCID, which have different application processes. You have to, apply to them directly. You'll have to put in your scores, and again, they'll kind of liaise directly with Acer. So it's not like you're going to have to download it in paper and send it to them by mail. They'll be able to access them, but obviously you do want to have those details available to you because you will have to put them in.
Lucky for Aaron, he's actually got his framed at home. So
Yeah, exactly. I was smart enough to print it off. But the candidate number, that's on the Acer website. That's not on the ticket. As in, you don't need the ticket to know your candidate number.
No, so it is going to be found on your ticket, but you can also find it on the website.
There's a backup. Okay.
Yeah.
In case I decide to reapply with my
Sure.
6-year-old GAMSAT result. Moving on to the actual scores. So you said before that there are 4 scores on your ticket, 1 for each section, and then 1 overall score, which is the Acer calculation with the weighing. I guess, what do these numbers mean? Are they out of something? What's the deal?
When we look at those scores, essentially what those scores are your GAMSAT section scores and your GAMSAT overall scores. So when we think about our results, it's really kind of easy to start thinking about them in ways that we can understand. So we often talk about things like percentiles or out of, but that isn't really quite how the GAMSAT works. Say in section 1, there are 75 questions. Your score of, say you get a 60, doesn't mean that you got 60 out of those 75 questions right. The GAMSAT is obviously a very complex psychometric test and kind of includes different mathematical models, which we can kind of discuss a little bit later on. And that means that it isn't, I guess, just linear. It isn't just, this is what I got out of this. And it also isn't a percentile. It doesn't mean that you are, if you get a score of 65, it doesn't mean that you got the 65th percentile in this section. That's just your objective GAMSAT score. That's, I guess, a score that Acer has determined, is indicative of your performance in this section.
You're talking about percentiles. What is a percentile? Because I know that they're mentioned in UCAT. People talk about percentiles a lot. And UCAT, I know we mentioned it before, ladies and gentlemen, is the essentially it's this undergraduate medical admission test. So we've got GAMSAT for postgrad, UCAT for undergrad. Anyway, so they talk about percentiles a lot. What's a percentile?
Sure. So essentially, percentiles are an easy way for us to understand how we've done on the GAMSAT. But the thing is, it's really more so a metric to help ourselves understand our performance rather than for universities to understand our performance. When universities look at your GAMSAT scores, they're going to look at the scores that are on the paper or on your GAMSAT ticket. They're not going to see how you've done in comparison to others. So this is a really important point to understand because obviously applicants may be, doing better in one year than another, but the percentiles might be different. So people might think, okay, well, I scored higher on the percentile kind of distribution in one year, but the overall score was lower. Maybe I should do that one because that means that I performed better in comparison to everybody else. But that's really not the best way to go about it. You should still be using the highest overall score or obviously the highest kind of GAMSAT score that you've calculated, whether it is the average one or the overall one, because that's what universities are going to be looking at. They're not going to be looking at your percentiles.
And remember as well that people will still have that GAMSAT score from the previous years, September, March, the year before, on hand, and then and the only sort of consistent thing is the GAMSAT score, right? So you really need to have that on hand, and that's the thing that universities are going to be, considering mainly in your application.
Yeah, exactly right.
So essentially what you're saying is that when I get any given GAMSAT score, that correlates to me being in, the top 5, top 10% of people. But say if I got a 60 for 1 year, that could be top 10%, but another year, that 64 could be top 5%, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So obviously, there's slight variations kind of every year. We do see, essentially, Acer publishes a distribution curve at the end of every GAMSAT, and this lets us know kind of how applicants have sat or have performed, on the GAMSAT for that given year.
That's on your GAMSAT ticket, isn't it? It's like on the back of your
So
GAMSAT ticket?
it's not actually on the GAMSAT
Right.
ticket itself, but it is information that is kind of available if you actually scroll down.
Is
It's
yours
on the
also,
same
is that
page,
also
isn't it?
framed, is it? On your...
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a little cross where I sit on the distribution curve.
So yeah, they kind of release those distribution curves, and that shows us how the cohorts have performed in general. So it's easy to, I guess, see your performance in the context of those percentiles, and we can see that the curve isn't the same every year. You do have slight variations, and that means that exactly like a 64, or that might lead us to think that a 64 in one year is different to a 64 in the other. But this is really the magic to the GAMSAT, that because of the way that it's structured and the way that it's actually marked, it allows for these scores to be consistent or to be used, from year to year, even if there are slight variations in, for example, the difficulty of the test or the strength of a cohort or anything like that.
Yeah.
So am I correct then in understanding that a 64 is equivalent to a 64 year to year, despite the fact that some years more people might get 64s and other years fewer people get 64s, for example?
Yeah, that's
Is
exactly
that
right.
correct?
Exactly. So, when we look at your applications, GAMSAT results are available for essentially 2 years, right? So it has to mean, that a particular score from 2 years ago has to be equivalent to a score from this year. Otherwise, it would be obviously unfair. Say a score or an exam this year was particularly easy, then that puts the people that sat the exam 2 years ago at a very big disadvantage.
Yeah,
so
that's a really good point, because I know it brings a lot of people quite a lot of anxiety on
Absolutely.
on that note, because they think, say for instance with COVID, very few people took the exam. The GAMSAT was full of all of these high performing students. It's going to bump down the average score, or relatively their percentile will be worse, so they're at a disadvantage. So you're saying that's not true.
No.
It should be fully consistent across the years. So really, for those listening at home, there should be no thinking about gaming when you do sit the exam. They should be consistent across all years.
Absolutely, that's exactly the case. The score, if I got a 64 last year, that's going to be equivalent to a 64 this year, regardless of how the rest of our cohort ended up kind of performing.
So you're saying that this number, this score, is sort of it's not an indicator of your competitiveness, not the same, at least the way the ATAR was, right? For example, where you got a number and that's your ranking. This is not a ranking. This is more like an IQ value, right? Or a smartness indicator per se. Is that?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think there's a little bit more to it than just like a smartness
I just
indicator.
want people to validate my GAMSAT
Well,
score.
exactly. I guess that kind of fits in line with somebody that actually has that framed on their wall. It makes sense that you would kind of believe that. But yeah, essentially, it's an indicator of your performance, your kind of objective performance on this test.
I guess the word that we should be using here is merit, really. It's
Yeah.
not really an indication of your intelligence, but your merit in the exam.
Exactly. Obviously, the exam tests, and again, we can talk about kind of the models behind it. The exam tests, very fundamental skills that obviously Acer has determined are essential for future doctors and such. So these essential skills are tested in the GAMSAT, and your performance on questions that test these skills, I guess, correlate to your final actual result. It is exactly based on your performance on it, not necessarily kind of how easy the exam was.
And for those of you at home who are thinking, I haven't seen any of these percentile curves, they're all available on the GAMSAT scores article on the Fraser's website, if you want to check that out.
A quick Google away. So, Kieran, would it then be correct to say that essentially the exam fluctuations predominantly are associated with the cohort rather than, the exam can be a little bit harder, a little bit easier, but sometimes you might get a stronger cohort that scores better overall, and you get more high scores, and sometimes you get a cohort that is perhaps less prepared for the exam and they score a little bit worse, and that accounts for the sort of bell curve distribution between the years. Is that a reasonable way of looking at it?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Again, it's all based on merit.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily that it was an easier or harder exam. If you got a 72, you got a 72. It wasn't that you were just lucky. That the GAMSAT is there to kind of minimize those lucky people from I guess getting through in a sense.
That's a perfect point to move on to Just asking, how is the GAMSAT then based on merit?
Sure. So I guess the underlying theory that proves to us or shows us that the GAMSAT is based on merit is this idea called item response theory. So item response theory is essentially a mathematical paradigm, if we want to call it, but essentially, it's a... Yeah, I know. No, it's kind of a theory or a mathematical model that allows for ACER to do a variety of different things. That means it allows them to kind of assign difficulty to different questions. It allows them to, I guess, tell if you're just guessing or if you're actually, performing well. It allows them to kind of test a variety of different skills. So
would that be sort of thinking, okay, the high-performing students tended to get this question wrong? That means that's a really hard question.
Sure. So it is somewhat impacted by performance on the day, but it is also kind of determined by ACER prior, to the exam. They do know, they essentially kind of rank questions to some degree by difficulty. They know which are the questions that for a particular skill set are, somewhat easier. Say pattern recognition, they'll know which are easier, which are harder, and then, depending on how students do on that, I guess, ranking of questions, depending how many of those they get right in, I guess, a sequential order, that's indicative of their grasp of that particular skill.
Yeah.
Interesting. And I guess this all plays into some of the things that we talk about in our masterclasses and in our workshops when we say that, yes, it is important to have a good, solid foundation in physics, chemistry, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, right, a lot of your understanding of the question and a lot of your chances of answering a question correctly comes from the correct logical and analytic method applied to the question itself, right? So spending hours and hours and hours revising every physics formula is only, a fraction of the full GAMSAT preparation story.
Yeah, definitely. That's, I think, a really, really important point for, I guess, prospective students to understand, because I, again, hear this all the time. People tell me, I studied, I went through 4 biology textbooks. I read, 7 physics textbooks, and I did this many chemistry questions. I understand the theory, but I wasn't able to do well. And that's because, exactly, at the end of the day, the GAMSAT, especially when we're talking about Section 3, is, sure, a kind of science reasoning exam. But I think the way I like to think about it is that it's dressed as a science exam, but the underlying, I guess, theory is testing more fundamental skills, because we have to understand that obviously the GAMSAT is, meant to be at a first-year university level for physics and chemistry, for biology and chemistry, and year 12 for physics. And I think most people can probably study that and get up to that level, but still we see so much variation. Yeah. So I think that's kind of indicative of the fact that it isn't just about your theoretical knowledge, but more so your kind of cognitive skills.
Yeah, and I think that's great and a good way to understand how to approach GAMSAT, I suppose. We're talking about scores today, but maybe thinking for people who are sort of approaching their GAMSAT study now, to think it's a skills exam rather than a content exam. So very different to your university preparation, which is often, testing your ability to regurgitate content and, be really content heavy. We're talking about a skills heavy exam, which wants you to, have different ways of thinking or show your skills and your different ways of thinking.
That's exactly right, yeah.
So I suppose we've now talked about how GAMSAT is merit-based. There's this thing called item response theory, which we've sort of talked about a little bit. But would you be able to elaborate on item response theory as a concept?
Sure. So I guess, yeah, item response theory is, it's a very kind of complicated mathematical model. But when we think about it in the context of the GAMSAT, again, it really comes down to this idea of it allows for ACER to assign different difficulties and really get an objective understanding of people's performance on the exam. So, it's, I guess, an idea that is used throughout a lot of different psychometric tests. So it has been, tried and tested. It allows for ACER to get this list of questions, understand, I guess, how people's performance correlates to their performance in these questions. And I guess it really underpins why the GAMSAT isn't your kind of section score isn't just a matter of adding how many questions you got right, because the questions are weighted in a sense according to difficulty. They aren't just weighted in I guess, an easy to understand way in the sense that this question is worth 1.2 marks and this question is worth, 4.7 marks or something like that. It's, I guess, a little bit more elaborate than that because it takes into consideration really a variety of different factors. It takes into consideration where this question is on the exam, what questions preceded it, whether you've just had to switch your mode of thinking. It's also dependent on just, I guess, the difficulty that ACER determines, this question is. So it is very kind of multifactorial.
It's interesting that you mentioned the placement of the question, because one of the things that we always talk about when we discuss quote-unquote GAMSAT hacks or exam navigation skills, as they really should be called, is that we talk about, flipping through the exam and reading time, dissecting it, understanding where your strengths, and when you're essentially, measuring yourself up against your enemy, being the exam, not the other candidates, of course. And that is sort of a technique that isn't, just part and parcel of every exam preparation. It's a technique that is directly developed to increase your odds or even your odds against item response theory, right? Because if you are finding it challenging to switch between modes of thinking, if you know that chemistry is your weak point but physics is your strong point, smashing through all the physics questions rather than jumping chemistry, physics is a way that you ensure consistency in your responses, right?
Yeah, sure. But obviously, like we were kind of talking about before, it isn't just segmented by chemistry and physics.
Right.
You might get,
yes, of course.
A chemistry question that is actually very akin to a physics question in the fundamental skill that they're testing, say data analysis. But yeah, absolutely.
So there's no one-size-fits-all technique.
No.
There's lots of techniques. Yeah.
No, exactly. And I think this is ultimately something to remember. So sure, we can kind of understand the fundamentals of how the GAMSAT is scored, and this, I guess, gives us an understanding and perhaps a sense of peace, and thinking, okay, I can understand that maybe I can do something with this. But really, I think at least the takeaway message that I take from this is that it just means that I have to keep trying to do as best as I can. It doesn't offer me any hacks or anything like that. This doesn't offer me, a secret understanding that I'm now going to be able to use to get 100 in every section or anything like that. It just means that the GAMSAT is very well thought out. It has a lot of science behind it, and I just have to make sure that I prepare thoroughly for all these kind of fundamental skills and try to do as best as I can in order to score well.
So it's not an arbitrary hurdle that we should be annoyed about.
No, exactly.
We should be annoyed about it. It's not arbitrary.
Yeah.
I have one point. So if we take that, what you've just said, does that mean that idea that certain students have of maybe doing the last questions first because they could be harder or less people are going to be attempting those questions because hardly anyone can complete section 3 in time? Would that mean that would benefit them to do that, or is this something that's not right?
Not necessarily, because again, it's not as black and white as, okay, we'll put the easy questions at the start and we'll put the hard questions at the end. It is a bit more complex than that. But yeah, there is, I guess, a certain element of placement being important in, where questions sit. Or, placement being relevant in, I guess, how these questions are weighted.
Right, so it's almost like ACER spent millions of dollars developing an exam that can't be hacked by doing it backwards.
Exactly. It'd be funny if that was like the way to do it, but I think people have tried, and I think they haven't been as successful as they might have wanted to be. So
look, if it makes you happy,
you can do it.
But not necessarily the be-all, end-all.
Yeah,
that's section in every section type of deal. Okay, so I guess you've been saying that this is a little bit of peace and comfort in the sense that the exam is systematic, it's designed to be fair and test merit. And perhaps it's not a hack. This knowledge isn't a hack in and of itself, but can you elaborate a little bit more? And you've already touched on this a little bit. What does this knowledge give you? How does this information impact your preparation or anybody's preparation?
Sure. So I guess one thing that it tells us is that, we're being tested on these fundamental cognitive skills, and this is really what we should be preparing to kind of perform on. It means that when it comes to Section 3, you don't have to understand everything about stereochemistry or organic chemistry in order to perform well, because the GAMSAT isn't testing that.
God, I still don't.
Yeah, I think that's a really great, insightful point you just brought up there, because I think so many people will be, hitting the textbooks, they'll be talking to tutors, and they'll be thinking about all the content that they have to learn. Don't do that. Kieran's saying, and I think he's right on the money with this. Think about the cognitive skills. Dissect what the question's actually getting you to do, and then work on those aspects. And I think, Fraser's has this question log, which is, can be useful, I think, in some ways. I think for those of you that are preparing, whether it's with a tutor or by yourself or whatever, you need to be thinking about dissecting the cognitive skill that the question's getting you to answer. So if you're, doing tons of biology questions, and you might not be noticing any sustained improvement, you need to be thinking, which aspects of my cognitive skills am I lacking here, rather than which aspects of the content am I missing here. And if you start, building on these skills, you can do so using the phrases, the question log. Exactly. If you use the question log, and you're actually able to identify these cognitive skills, then I think you can make meaningful inroads into improving.
Yeah, definitely.
The one thing that's always been comforting for me when people talk about, you have to do, first year biochem, year 12 physics, is that the syllabus for first year, like what on earth is the syllabus of first year biology? You go to every university, even in Victoria, that syllabus is going to be different.
Yeah.
Right? You go across Australia, that syllabus is multiplied by, 23 different variations and permutations. So I think that should be the number one indicator to you that clearly the content here is important, but it's not key. Right?
Exactly. I mean, the GAMSAT is a test that's not only used in Australia, but is obviously used, overseas as well, like in the UK. So ultimately, it has to be accessible.
Yeah,
that's true.
And therefore that means that the content is obviously relevant because they are testing it in some level, but it's ultimately those skills that are going to translate to you being a doctor that are being tested here.
There's some like Eastern European countries, I think, that also accept the GAMSAT. I want to say, I looked this up at some point. It's on our website. Maybe Poland, some place
really?
accepts the GAMSAT for medical. Like, it's not that primary mode of admission sort of testing, but it is one of, I think it's for internationals primarily.
If we get a Polish listener, I will be so happy.
So if we get a Polish listener, please
send us an email.
Send us an email, but also, clearly, the Polish first year biology syllabus, I don't even know what they would learn, right? I imagine similar things, but still slightly different, right?
Yeah.
In Polish, of course. Yeah. Good.
You've been great in what you've been able to bring to the table today. I think so many people, have a rough idea of GAMSAT scores, but what you've done is you've taken it to the next level, and I think that ultimately they'll not only be able to understand their score better, but now they can understand how to take that information and approach the GAMSAT better as well.
Absolutely, and if you'd like any of this in written form, so you can sort of spend hours poring over it. We do have an article about this on our website.
So I believe the article at the moment is titled GAMSAT Scores 2021. So that'll give you, I guess, a good insight into what we've spoken about today. It also goes a little bit into kind of GPA calculations, what is a good enough GAMSAT score, what isn't a good enough GAMSAT score, that kind of stuff.
And there's a GPA calculator attached to it as well, isn't there?
Yeah, it's not on the article, but it can definitely be found on the website.
It's on the website, so it's somewhere in that down that rabbit hole. Follow the hyperlinks.
We'll put it in the show notes as well, so
Actually,
it's easy for you all to access.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. You've really been invaluable, insightful. I certainly learned something.
I learned so much. It's not. Aaron's, just had this GAMSAT score on his wall.
It's become more valuable
but
to
now
me
he
now.
understands it.
Yeah, maybe I should sell it on Antiques Roadshow. Yeah, it's good. Guys, by the way, I definitely don't have it framed. Just. Yeah,
he does believe at his core, though, that GAMSAT is about smartness.
Well, I think anybody that scored well probably down under definitely thinks that.
Never gonna look
beneath everything. Yeah.
All right, thanks so much, guys, and this has been the Pre-Admission Gang. Catch you next time.